condemned by the living as a sinner of impurity, revealed in the dark by the very priests he ruled. His passionate private life fueled a public crisis that set his kingdom on a path to civil war and ultimately led to the tragic execution of his heir. Yet the same hands that wrote passionate love letters to his homosexual lover were the same hands that gave the world one of the holiest Bibles. The same king who was considered an enemy was hailed as the father of the kingdom of England. His name was James I. How could a king chosen by God, a family man, risk everything? His political authority, the stability of his kingdom, and the legacy of his dynasty. For his all-consuming devotion to another man, to truly understand the man James would become, the king who would give everything for the love of a beautiful young courtier, you must first understand the terrifying, blood-soaked world that created him. His story does not begin in a palace of peaceful splendor, but in a realm torn apart by religious fanaticism, murderous ambition, and the tragic reign of his mother Mary, Queen of Scots. James was born on the 19th of June, 1566, a pawn in a brutal game of power before he could even walk. His mother Mary was a magnetic, intelligent, and fatally impulsive ruler, a devout Catholic in a nation being ripped apart by the Protestant Reformation. She was viewed with deep suspicion by her own powerful noblemen, chief among them the fire and brimstone preacher, John Knox, who saw in her a Jezebel destined to lead Scotland to ruin. His father was Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, a man whose breathtaking beauty was matched only by his arrogance, his immaturity, and his treacherous heart. Their marriage, initially a passionate love match, had disintegrated into a toxic stew of jealousy and political scheming. The very air in Holyrood Palace crackled with paranoia. Just 3 months before James's birth, a pregnant Queen Mary witnessed an act of savagery that would scar her for life. A gang of Protestant lords, incited by her own husband Darnley, burst into her private supper chamber. They were there for her private secretary and dear friend, the Italian musician David Rizzio, accusing him of being a papal agent, and more insultingly, the Queen's lover. They dragged the screaming Rizzio from the hem of her gown and brutally stabbed him to death over 50 times. Mary was held at gunpoint, a helpless observer to the butchery. The message was clear. No one was safe, and her husband was her enemy. This was the violent, treacherous world into which the infant James was delivered. His birth was not a moment of national celebration, but a brief lull in the storm. The fragile peace was shattered less than a year later. On the night of February 10th, 1567, the house at Kirklefield, where Lord Darnley was recuperating from an illness, was obliterated by a massive gunpowder explosion. Darnley's body, along with that of his valet, was found in a nearby orchard, strangely untouched by the blast, but showing signs of suffocation. He had been strangled. Suspicion immediately fell upon the Earl of Bothwell, a charismatic and ruthless nobleman, and, scandalously, upon the Queen herself. Whether Mary was a knowing accomplice or merely a bystander who chose to look away remains one of history's great debates. But in the court of public opinion, her fate was sealed. When a mere 3 months after her husband's murder she married Bothwell, the man universally believed to be the lead assassin, the Scottish lords rose up in open rebellion. They saw it as an unforgivable act, proof of her complicity and her unfitness to rule. Mary's forces were defeated. She was imprisoned in a castle on an island in Loch Leven, and there, under threat of death, she was forced to sign the instrument of her own abdication. Her son James, just 13 months old, was now King of Scotland. The coronation of James VI of Scotland, held in the Church of the Holy Rood in Stirling, was a surreal and somber affair. Imagine a bewildered toddler, barely able to stand, being anointed with holy oil and draped in coronation robes. The heavy crown of Scotland had to be held over his head by a nobleman, for it would have crushed his tiny frame. The reformer John Knox preached the sermon, his voice thundering with warnings against idolatry and the sins of the new king's mother. This ceremony was not about celebrating a new monarch. It was a political statement, a stark and public rejection of Mary and her Catholic faith. James was now a symbol, a Protestant figurehead for a regency government controlled by ambitious lords who had deposed and would soon drive into exile his own mother. He would never see her again. For the next 17 years, Mary would be a prisoner in England, a constant source of Catholic plots against her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I, until her eventual execution in 1587. James, a young man by then, made only a formal protest. He had been raised to see his mother not as a loving parent, but as an adulteress, a murderer, and a dangerous Catholic threat to his own throne and his very life. His childhood was a relentless masterclass in survival. He was a king without power, a son without parents, a prize to be fought over by warring factions. His early life was a succession of regents, many of whom met violent ends. His own maternal uncle, the Earl of Moray, was assassinated. His paternal grandfather, the Earl of Lennox, was also shot and killed during a raid. He grew up in the stark, cold walls of Stirling Castle, a fortress designed more for his protection or his imprisonment than for his comfort. His daily reality was one of constant surveillance and simmering danger. He learned, with the preternatural instinct of a child in peril, to read the hidden motives in a courtier's smile, to sense the threat behind a flattering word. He learned that trust was a trap and that affection was a currency to be spent with extreme caution. Deprived of parental love, he found a harsh and demanding father figure in his principal tutor, George Buchanan. Buchanan was a celebrated scholar of European renown, a brilliant intellectual, but also a stern, unyielding Calvinist who despised the very idea of absolute monarchy. He saw it as his solemn duty to mold James into a king who would be subservient to the church and the law. His methods were brutal. He subjected the young king to a punishingly rigorous academic schedule, from dawn until dusk, cramming his head with Latin, Greek, French, theology, and political theory. He also subjected him to regular beatings, believing that a royal backside was no different from any other when it came to discipline. Buchanan's goal was to beat the concept of the divine right of kings out of his young charge. He wrote a treatise, De Jure Regni Apud Scotos, the law of kingship among the Scots, which argued that ultimate power lay with the people who had the right to depose and even execute a tyrannical monarch. He forced James to read and study this text, a direct refutation of the principles of sacred kingship that James would later espouse with such passion. This intellectual abuse created a profound and lasting conflict in James's mind. He was being taught by his mentor that his authority was conditional, while every fiber of his being, every instinct for survival, told him that his only true safety lay in possessing absolute God-given power that no earthly lord could challenge. His future writings on the divine right of kings were not just abstract political theory. They were a direct personal rebuttal to the psychological torment of George Buchanan, a desperate assertion of his own worth and security in a world that had shown him none. It was in this cold, lonely, and intellectually combative environment that a deep, aching void opened up in the young king's heart. He craved warmth, loyalty, and an affection that was not contingent on his political utility. And in 1579, when he was 13 years old, he thought he had finally found it. a man arrived at the Scottish court who would change his life forever. His name was Stuart. He was James's first cousin once removed, a sophisticated, charming nobleman who had grown up in France. He was 37 years old, a worldly and captivating figure who stepped into the gray, austere Scottish court like a creature from another planet. James was instantly and completely smitten. Esme Stuart possessed all the grace, confidence, and easy warmth that the awkward, lonely teenager lacked. For the first time, James experienced something akin to adoration. He showered Stuart with titles and lands, elevating him in just 2 years from a foreign visitor to the Earl, and then the Duke of Lennox, the only duke in Scotland. He was made Lord High Chamberlain and was given precedence over all other nobles. James trusted him implicitly, consulting him on all matters of state and spending every possible moment in his company. The court chronicler David Moisey wrote that the king was in such love with him as in the open sight of the people. Oftentimes he would clasp him about the neck and kiss him. The Scottish lords, the grim-faced Calvinist nobles known as the Kirk, watched this blossoming relationship with horror and fury. They saw their own influence over the king evaporating, replaced by that of this Frenchified, effeminate newcomer. They whispered that Lennox was a secret Catholic agent sent by the Pope to corrupt their Protestant king and return Scotland to the fold of Rome. Worse still, they whispered of an unnatural affection, using the coded language of the time to accuse the two of sodomy. The intimacy between the king and his favorite was not just a political problem, it was a moral abomination. Their resentment festered until August 1582, when a faction of Protestant nobles, led by the Earl of Gorey, took drastic action. In what became known as the Ruthven Raid, they ambushed the king while he was out hunting and took him prisoner. They held the 16-year-old James captive at Ruthven Castle, forcing him to sign a proclamation denouncing Lennox's influence. The central demand of his kidnappers was that Esme Stuart be banished from Scotland forever. James wept, raged, and pleaded, but he was powerless. He was forced to watch as the first person he had ever truly loved was hounded out of the kingdom. Lennox retreated to France, where he died of a fever less than a year later, still professing his love for his young king and his innocence of the charges laid against him. James was left utterly heartbroken, but he had learned a brutal and unforgettable lesson. His private heart was a public battlefield, and his enemies would use his deepest affections as their most powerful weapon against him. The trauma of the Ruthven Raid and the loss of Lennox would echo throughout his entire life, shaping his deep-seated fear of rebellious nobles and his desperate, lifelong search for another man to whom he could give his complete and total devotion. As he matured into his majority and took firm control of his kingdom, James proved to be a shrewd and capable ruler. He skillfully played the warring factions of his court against one another, gradually consolidating his power. He also had to secure his succession, and for that he needed a wife and an heir. In 1589, a marriage was arranged with the 14-year-old Princess Anne of Denmark. Theirs was a union born of diplomacy, but it began with a spark of genuine romance and adventure. When Anne's fleet was driven back by storms while attempting to sail to Scotland, the impatient James, in a rare display of chivalric dash, decided to sail to Norway to fetch his bride himself. They were married there and spent the winter in a celebratory haze in Denmark before returning to Scotland. Initially, the couple was affectionate. James wrote poetry for her and seems to have been genuinely fond of his vivacious, stylish, and cultured young wife. Anne, for her part, gave him what the kingdom most desperately needed: children. Their firstborn, the brilliant and promising Prince Henry, arrived in 1594, followed by a daughter, Elizabeth, and another son, Charles, the sickly, overlooked second son who would one day inherit the throne. Anne established her own magnificent court, becoming a great patron of artists, architects like Inigo Jones, and spectacular theatrical productions called masques. But over time, their relationship cooled into a polite, if distant, partnership. They developed separate interests, separate households, and separate circles of friends. While they maintained the public image of a royal family, their private lives drifted apart, leaving that emotional void in James's heart as empty as it had ever been. All the while, he kept his eyes fixed on the great prize to the south, the throne of England. As Queen Elizabeth I grew old and frail, the long sunset of the Tudor dynasty began. Childless and unmarried, her closest living relative was James. For years, he engaged in a delicate and secret correspondence with Elizabeth's chief minister, Sir Robert Cecil, carefully positioning himself as the inevitable heir. When the great queen finally died on March 24, 1603, Cecil's meticulous planning paid off. A courier rode north like the wind, and within days, James VI of Scotland was proclaimed King James I of England. His journey south was a triumphal procession. He was leaving behind the relative poverty and perpetual strife of Scotland for a kingdom that seemed to him a promised land of unimaginable wealth, sophistication, and power. He was now the ruler of two realms, the founder of a new Stuart dynasty. He came with grand ideas of uniting his kingdoms into a single entity, Great Britain, under one king, one law, and one faith. He presented himself to his new English subjects as Rex Pacificus, the peacemaker king, a scholarly, experienced monarch who would bring an end to the long, costly wars of Elizabeth's reign. He had a wife, a healthy heir, and the divine authority he had spent his entire life fighting to defend. To the outside world, the lonely boy from Stirling Castle had finally achieved everything, but the fundamental patterns of his psyche, forged in the trauma of his youth, remained unchanged. The deep-seated need for an all-consuming personal devotion, the craving for a loyal partner who would be his and his alone, had not gone away. And the English court, with its glamour, its intrigue, and its dazzling constellation of beautiful, ambitious young men, was about to provide him with the most intoxicating and dangerous relationship of his life. When King James I journeyed south in the spring of 1603, he entered a world entirely alien to him. The England he inherited was the England of the late Renaissance, a nation basking in the afterglow of Shakespeare, the defeat of the Spanish Armada, and the long, iconic reign of Elizabeth I. Its court was a theater of immense wealth, intricate etiquette, and carefully veiled power plays. For James, who had spent his life navigating the dour, dangerous, and perpetually bankrupt world of Scottish politics, it was like stepping from a cold stone fortress into a gilded cage. He was astounded by the opulence, writing back to his friends in Scotland that he was swapping a stony couch for a deep feather bed. The great houses of the English aristocracy, where he was entertained on his journey to London, were marvels of luxury he could scarcely have imagined, but the culture shock ran far deeper than mere architecture and finance. The English court was governed by a strict, almost fossilized code of conduct inherited from the Virgin Queen. Courtiers moved with a choreographed grace. Their speech was a tapestry of elegant flattery and classical allusion, and access to the monarch was a privilege guarded by layers of ceremony. Into this delicate ecosystem stumbled James. He was a king, yes, but he was a king who preferred the rough camaraderie of the hunt to the stilted formalities of the throne room. His appearance was, to the fastidious English courtiers, a source of constant dismay. He had a habit of letting his tongue loll about in his mouth, which some attributed to a physical ailment and others to simple inelegance. His clothes were often disheveled, padded for fear of assassins, a paranoia born of his traumatic youth, and he was notoriously lax about personal hygiene. His thick, nearly incomprehensible Scottish accent grated on English ears, and his manner was shockingly informal. He would lean on his courtiers, treat them with a tactile familiarity, and speak with a blunt, often crude wit that shattered the refined veneer of Elizabethan discourse. He was a brilliant man, a genuine scholar, who could debate theology with the sharpest minds in Europe, but he was utterly lacking in the theatrical majesty that the English expected of their monarch. They had traded their semi-divine Gloriana for a shambling intellectual Scot who seemed more at home in a library or on a horse than on a throne. Sir John Harrington, a witty courtier, summed up the court's bewildered reaction. "He doth wondrously covet learned discourse and praise to the witty," he wrote, "but he hath a fashion of forsaking his quarry for a carrion." This fundamental disconnect between James's personality and the expectations of his new court created a fertile ground for the rise of favorites. James hated the administrative drudgery of kingship, the endless petitions, the tedious council meetings, the complex financial reports. He delegated. He wanted a buffer, an intermediary, a trusted companion who could manage the day-to-day business of government while he pursued his own passions, theological writing, and above all, hunting. Hunting was more than a sport for James. It was an obsession, an escape. Out in the field, chasing a stag, he was free from the suffocating pressures of the court. He could be himself. What he needed was someone to run the country while he was away. This created a vacuum of power right next to the throne, and ambitious men were quick to see the opportunity. The first Englishman to truly capture the king's affection was a handsome young man named Robert Carr. The story of their meeting is the stuff of courtly legend. In 1607, during a royal tilting tournament, Carr, then a young and relatively unknown page from a Scottish border family, was thrown from his horse directly in front of the king. The fall was severe. He broke his leg. James, ever a man of sentiment and impulse, was immediately concerned. He had Carr carried into the palace, personally oversaw his medical care, and visited his bedside daily as he recovered. By the time Carr's leg had mended, he had won the king's heart. Robert Carr was, by all accounts, exceptionally good-looking. He had a physical grace and a quiet charm that James found irresistible. But unlike the sophisticated Esme Stuart or the brilliant George Villiers to come, Carr was not a man of great intellect or political cunning. He was, in essence, a beautiful vessel waiting to be filled. His spectacular rise was fueled entirely by the king's infatuation. James knighted him, made him a gentleman of the bedchamber, and began to teach him Latin himself, trying to mold his new favorite into a statesman. Titles and riches followed in a torrent. He was made Viscount Rochester, a Knight of the Garter, and eventually the Earl of Somerset. He became the king's constant companion, the conduit through which all royal patronage flowed. James doted on him, showering him with affection and relying on him completely. But Carr's lack of innate political skill meant he needed his own advisor, a man behind the man. He found one in Sir Thomas Overbury. Overbury was everything Carr was not. Fiercely intelligent, politically astute, a gifted writer, but also arrogant, abrasive, and universally disliked. The two formed a powerful partnership. Overbury was the brain. Carr was the beauty. Overbury guided Carr's every political move, wrote his official correspondence and helped him navigate the treacherous currents of the court. For a time, they were invincible, the gatekeepers to the king's favor. But their symbiotic relationship was about to be shattered by a woman who would lead them all into a dark labyrinth of obsession, poison, and murder. Her name was Frances Howard. She was the daughter of the powerful Earl of Suffolk, the scion of the great Howard clan, one of the most ambitious and pro-Catholic families in England. Frances was celebrated for her stunning beauty, but she was also headstrong, vain, and utterly ruthless. She was trapped in a miserable, humiliating marriage. At the tender age of 13, she had been married off to the 14-year-old Robert Devereux, the third Earl of Essex, for purely political reasons. To ensure the marriage would not be consummated prematurely, the young couple was separated immediately after the ceremony. When Essex returned from his travels a few years later, ready to claim his wife, he found that Frances had nothing but contempt for him. She refused to sleep with him, and sometime around 1611, she fell passionately in love with the king's favorite, Robert Carr. Their affair was the scandal of the court. It was torrid, public, and dangerous. Carr was obsessed with her, and Frances saw in him a path to a life of glamour and power she craved. There was just one obstacle: her husband. Divorce was all but impossible in the 17th century. The only way out was an annulment, a declaration that the marriage had never been valid in the first place. With the backing of her powerful family and the infatuated Robert Carr, Frances launched a campaign to have her marriage to Essex annulled on the grounds of his impotence. It was a shocking and deeply embarrassing claim. To make it legally viable, she had to argue not that he was generally impotent, but that he was impotent only with her, a condition known as maleficium versus Hank, often attributed to witchcraft. This is where the partnership between Carr and Overbury began to crack. Thomas Overbury, who had guided Carr to power, saw Frances Howard for exactly what she was: a dangerous liability. He loathed the Howards, viewing them as corrupt, pro-Spanish rivals. He believed an alliance with them would be political suicide for Carr. More than that, he seems to have developed a visceral personal hatred for Frances. He warned Carr in the strongest possible terms to end the affair. "My lord," he is reported to have said, "I see this woman will be your overthrow. If you do marry that filthy, base woman, you will utterly ruin your honor and yourself. You shall never do it by my advice or consent." He went further, penning a popular poem called A Wife, which described the ideal virtuous woman, a thinly veiled and deeply insulting contrast to the adulterous Frances. When Frances learned that Overbury was not only trying to prevent her marriage but was also insulting her character, her fury knew no bounds. She and her formidable great-uncle, the Earl of Northampton, decided that Overbury had to be removed. Permanently, they devised a cunning trap. Knowing that James disliked Overbury's arrogance, they persuaded the king to offer Overbury a prestigious but distant diplomatic post as an ambassador to Russia. It was an offer a courtier could not refuse without gravely insulting the monarch. But Carr, in a staggering act of betrayal against the man who had made him, went to his friend and advised him to reject the offer. He assured Overbury that he would smooth things over with the king, convincing him that he was too valuable to be sent away. Overbury fell for it. He refused the king's appointment. James, as predicted, was enraged by this blatant act of disobedience. On April 26, 1613, Sir Thomas Overbury was arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London at the king's pleasure. With Overbury locked away, the path was clear for Frances. The annulment commission, heavily influenced by the king, who wanted his favorite to be happy, controversially granted her petition. The Earl of Essex was publicly humiliated, and Frances Howard was free to marry Robert Carr. But for Frances, simply silencing Overbury was not enough. He had insulted her honor, threatened her ambition, and he knew too many of their secrets. He had to die. What followed was one of the most cold-blooded and meticulously planned murders in English history. Frances, using her influence, had the loyal lieutenant of the Tower replaced with a new man, Sir Gervase Helwyss, who was in her pocket. She then arranged for one of her own servants, a woman named Anne Turner, to place a man named Richard Weston as Overbury's personal keeper. Through this network, a steady stream of poison began to flow into the Tower. It was administered in his food and drink. Weston laced Overbury's meals with white arsenic, mercury, and cantharides. Frances herself, a frequent visitor to the Tower, sent him gifts of tarts and jellies, which she had personally poisoned. The plan was to make it look like a natural death, a slow-wasting disease like consumption. For months, Overbury languished in his cell, his body racked with unimaginable pain. He suffered from vomiting, dysentery, and excruciating stomach ailments. He wrote desperate letters to Carr, begging his old friend for help, having no idea that Carr was complicit in his slow murder. Finally, his tormentors grew impatient. In September 1613, after nearly 5 months of agony, a final lethal dose was administered by an apothecary's assistant, who was bribed to give Overbury an enema loaded with mercury sublimate. The next day, Sir Thomas Overbury was dead. His emaciated body was hastily buried in the Tower grounds, the cause of death officially listed as natural causes. 2 months later, in a blaze of glory, Frances Howard married Robert Carr, now the Earl of Somerset. The wedding was the most extravagant social event of the decade. The king himself paid for the lavish celebrations, which lasted for days. The court's greatest poets, including John Donne, wrote verses in their honor. The couple was at the absolute zenith of their power and influence, seemingly untouchable. They had removed their enemy, secured their marriage, and they had the king's unconditional love. They had gotten away with murder, or so they thought. But secrets in a court as gossipy and faction-ridden as James's rarely stay buried for long. Rumors began to circulate. People wondered about the convenient timing of Overbury's death. 2 years passed, but the whispers grew louder. The breakthrough came in the summer of 1615. An apothecary's apprentice on his deathbed in Flanders confessed his role in preparing the poisoned enema. The story reached the ears of Sir Ralph Winwood, the King's Secretary of State, and an enemy of the Howard faction. He launched a secret investigation. Slowly, meticulously, he and the brilliant lawyer Sir Francis Bacon began to unravel the conspiracy. They found the apothecary. They found Richard Weston, the keeper. Under interrogation, Weston cracked, confessing everything and implicating all the key players: Anne Turner, Sir Gervase Helwyss, and at the very top, the Earl and Countess of Somerset. When the evidence was brought before King James, he was thunderstruck. The idea that his beloved Carr, the man he had elevated and adored, could be involved in such a monstrous crime was almost too much to bear. But the evidence was undeniable. With a heavy heart, he ordered the arrest of his favorite and his wife. He swore a solemn oath, declaring, "If I spare any of them, may God's curse light on me and my posterity forever." The trials that followed gripped the nation. It was a scandal of unimaginable proportions, implicating the highest levels of the aristocracy in a sordid tale of lust, betrayal, and black magic. Anne Turner was also accused of being a witch. The lesser conspirators, Weston, Helwyss, Turner, and the apothecary, were all tried, found guilty, and publicly hanged. The main event was the trial of the Earl and Countess themselves. Frances, perhaps in a fit of conscience or simply seeing the hopelessness of her situation, confessed. She was found guilty and sentenced to death. Carr, arrogant to the last, maintained his innocence, but the evidence, including Overbury's desperate letters from the Tower, was overwhelming. He too was found guilty and condemned to die. The king was now in an impossible position. He had sworn a public oath to see justice done, but he could not bring himself to sign the death warrant for the man he had loved so dearly. He was tormented. In the end, he did what he had always done. He followed his heart over his head. He commuted their sentences. Robert Carr and Francis Howard were not executed. They were imprisoned in the Tower of London, the very place where they had murdered their former friend. They remained there for 6 years before being quietly pardoned and allowed to retire in disgraced obscurity. Their great love, for which they had risked and killed, curdled into hatred in the confines of their imprisonment. For James, the fallout was catastrophic. The Overbury affair shattered the mystique of his court, exposing it as a nest of corruption and murder. His own judgment was called into serious question. How could the wisest fool in Christendom have been so blind to the character of the man he had placed at the center of his government? The scandal left him publicly humiliated and privately heartbroken. He was once again alone, his trust shattered, his affection betrayed. By the year 1614, the Jacobean court was a kingdom holding its breath. The sun was setting on the reign of Robert Carr, Earl of Somerset. Though he still possessed the king's affection, it was a love curdled by scandal, soured by his association with the venomous Howard clan, and made politically radioactive by his own growing arrogance. Dark whispers surrounding Sir Thomas Overbury's death were growing into a damning chorus that would soon be impossible to ignore. A powerful coalition of his enemies, led by the sternly Protestant Archbishop George Abbot and the influential Earl of Pembroke, saw the moment was ripe for a coup. But this would be a coup of a different sort, not of swords and daggers, but of beauty and seduction. They understood King James's essential nature. He could not function without a human anchor in the stormy sea of statecraft. To simply tear Carr down would create a power vacuum. Their strategy was therefore one of breathtaking audacity. They would not wait for a new star to rise by chance. They would handpick, groom, and launch a celestial body of their own design, a living masterpiece so irresistible that the king would have to turn his gaze from his tarnished favorite. Their search led them not to the great noble houses, but to the 21-year-old son of a minor Leicestershire gentleman. He had no titles, no great fortune, and no political experience, but he possessed assets more valuable than all the castles in the land. His name was George Villiers. He was not merely handsome. He radiated a presence that drew every gaze, said to silence conversation wherever he appeared. He had the lithe, athletic grace of a dancer and the easy, disarming confidence of a man who has never known a moment of self-doubt. Villiers was not, however, an uncut diamond. He was the carefully polished product of one of the most formidable women of the age, his mother, Mary Villiers. A widow of the minor gentry with limited means, Mary possessed an iron will and a boundless ambition for her stunningly handsome second son. Recognizing he was not academically inclined, she scraped together her funds and, in a stroke of genius, sent him to France for 3 years. He was not there to study philosophy, but to attend a finishing school for the courtly arts. He learned to fence with lethal grace, to dance the intricate galliards of the European courts, and to wear fashionable clothes with nonchalant elegance. Mary Villiers was not raising a scholar or a soldier. She was forging a courtier, a weapon of charm designed to conquer the king's heart. When George Villiers returned to England in 1614, he was 21 years old and a walking work of art. His patrons, the anti-Howard faction, saw him and knew instantly that they had found their man. Their plan was simple. They would pool their resources to buy him a fashionable wardrobe, secure him a minor position at court as a royal cupbearer, a role that guaranteed he would be seen by the king, and then they would simply place him in James's line of sight and let nature and the king's well-known proclivities take their course. The carefully orchestrated debut took place at a hunting lodge at Appothorpe in August 1614. James, away from the formalities of London, was in his element. And there, in the relaxed atmosphere of the royal hunt, was George Villiers. Contemporary accounts of this first meeting are electric. They describe a king, now nearing 50, weary and disillusioned, his gaze falling upon this vision of youthful perfection. The contrast with the brooding, increasingly difficult Robert Carr could not have been more stark. Villiers was cheerful, radiant, and refreshingly uncomplicated. The king was, by all accounts, immediately and profoundly captivated. The next stage of the plan was to showcase their new star in the most spectacular setting possible, a court masque. These were the glittering theatrical centerpieces of Jacobean court life, extravagant productions combining poetry, music, dance, and fantastical stagecraft. For a performance before the king, Villiers was given a prominent role. He was not required to speak lines, he simply had to be himself, to dance with his signature grace, to move with his natural athleticism, to be a radiant object of beauty for the royal eye to feast upon. The king watched, mesmerized. The die was cast. James had found his new obsession. He began to test the waters, to see how his court would react. He famously turned to one of his oldest and most trusted servants, Sir John Graham, and asked his opinion of the handsome young man. Graham, a shrewd operator who knew precisely what the king wanted to hear, replied enthusiastically, "Of all the dancers I have ever seen, this one is the best." But James, still hesitant, still tied by threads of loyalty to Robert Carr, is said to have sighed, "Jesus, his face is the best of all." It was this almost divine beauty that James latched onto. Soon after, he gave Villiers the nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life, Steenie. The name was a reference to St. Stephen, who in the Acts of the Apostles was described as having the face of an angel as he was being stoned to death. For a king as steeped in theology as James, this was no casual pet name. It was a declaration of an almost spiritual adoration. He saw in Villiers a glimpse of heavenly perfection. The rise of Steenie created an immediate and palpable tension in the court. For a year, a strange and unstable political landscape emerged, a court with two suns in its sky. The king's heart was divided. On one side stood Robert Carr, the Earl of Somerset, the established favorite now clinging to power, his face a mask of jealousy and fury. On the other stood George Villiers, the ascendant star, a paragon of youthful charm, playing his part with a brilliant, calculated humility. The court split into factions, lining up behind their chosen champion. A courtier at the time wrote that it was as if the court were a stage and every man an actor. Carr did everything in his power to destroy his rival. He used his remaining influence to block Villiers' appointments and spread malicious rumors. He once engineered a situation where a rival courtier intentionally spilled a drink on Villiers' fine clothes, hoping to provoke a duel that would get Villiers banished from court. But Villiers, coached by his handlers, was too clever to fall into the trap. He turned the other cheek, displaying a meekness that only made him more appealing to the king, who hated violence and confrontation. The anti-Carr faction realized they needed a more powerful ally to tip the scales. They turned to the one person whose influence over the king though different, was still significant: Queen Anne. Initially, Anne had been suspicious of the plot to install a new favorite. She saw Villiers as a puppet of the Pembroke faction and refused to help. But they were persistent, eventually persuading her that Villiers would be a better, more manageable influence on her husband than the toxic Somerset. In a famous and probably well-rehearsed scene, the Queen formally recommended Villiers to the king. She reportedly told him, "My lord, you are a king, and the greatest king in Christendom. If you want a favorite, you may take him. But if you will have a favorite, let me have a share in him." This royal blessing was the final piece of the puzzle. It gave James the public justification he needed to fully transfer his affections. In April 1615, in a ceremony dripping with significance, James knighted George Villiers and appointed him a gentleman of the bedchamber. This position was the key to true power. It gave him unrestricted access to the king's private apartments, his dressing room, his bedroom. It was a position of staggering intimacy. During the ceremony, the king was said to have been so openly affectionate that it scandalized the onlookers. The tide had turned. Just a few months later, the Overbury scandal would finally break, and Carr's arrest would clear the stage completely. The era of Somerset was over. The era of Buckingham had begun. If Robert Carr's ascent had been swift, Buckingham's was explosive. Within a year, he was the most powerful man in England. It was as if James, having been freed from his unhappy attachment to Carr, was now determined to heap every honor imaginable upon the man he saw as his savior. The speed and scale of Villiers' ascent left the traditional aristocracy breathless and aghast. Within a year of his knighting, he was made a Knight of the Garter, the highest order of chivalry, and elevated to the peerage as Viscount Villiers. A year later, in 1617, he was made the Earl of Buckingham. The year after that, a Marquess. And finally, in 1623, he would be granted the ultimate title, Duke of Buckingham, the first non-royal duke created in England for over half a century. His accumulation of wealth and power was just as staggering. He was given lands, castles, and lucrative monopolies over everything from the licensing of inns to the gold and silver thread industry. He was appointed to the most powerful offices of state: Master of the Horse, Lord High Admiral of the Fleet, Lord Warden of the Cinque Ports. He became, in effect, the king's sole chief minister. Nothing was done without his approval. If you wanted a job, a title, a legal judgment in your favor, a pension, or even just a brief audience with the king, you had to go through Buckingham. He was the gatekeeper, the dispenser of all royal patronage, the brilliant sun around which the entire court now orbited. And what of the nature of the relationship that fueled this unprecedented rise? For centuries, historians, often constrained by the mores of their own time, tried to frame it as a deep but platonic friendship, a father-son dynamic. But the evidence left behind in the king's own hand tells a story of far greater passion, one of profound and consuming love. Their surviving letters, never meant for public eyes, reveal a king who abandoned all royal formality for his beloved Steenie. He adopted a startlingly domestic and romantic persona. He frequently signed his letters to Buckingham as "thy dear dad and steward," and later, more astonishingly, as "thy dear dad and husband." He in turn addressed Buckingham as his sweet child and wife. The language is that of a lover, filled with a desperate physical longing. When Buckingham was sick, James wrote, "My only sweet and dear child, I pray thee, haste thee home to thy dear dad by sunsetting, and so the Lord bless and comfort thee, my sweet child, and give a blessing to our meeting and joyful welcoming of each other." When they were separated, the king's letters were filled with an almost painful yearning. "I cannot now content myself without sending you this letter," he wrote on another occasion, "praying God that I may have a joyful and comfortable meeting with you, and that we may make at this Christmas a new marriage, ever to be kept hereafter. And so God bless you, my sweet child and wife, and grant that ye may ever be a comfort to your dear dad and husband." A new marriage. The phrase is unambiguous, a testament to a bond James considered as sacred and binding as a sacrament. Buckingham, for his part, was a masterful correspondent. Whether his feelings were entirely genuine or a brilliant performance of affection is a question historians will debate forever. But there is no doubt he played his role to perfection, responding with a passion that matched the king's own. He wrote to James, "I desire to live in this world no longer than I may be a comfort to you, my dear dad and master. I will live and die a lover of you." He would sign his letters, "Your Majesty's most humble slave and dog, Steenie." The sheer physicality of their bond shocked the court. Foreign ambassadors wrote home in dispatches, describing how the king would constantly lean on Buckingham's shoulder, stroke his face, and tumble and kiss him as a mistress. The Puritan diarist Sir Symonds D'Ewes recorded with disgust the rumor that Buckingham would dandle with his codpiece. In one famous public confrontation with his Privy Council, who had dared to question Buckingham's influence, James silenced them with a declaration of breathtaking audacity. "I, James, am neither a god nor an angel, but a man like any other. Therefore I act like a man and confess to loving those dear to me more than other men. You may be sure that I love the Earl of Buckingham more than anyone else. Jesus Christ had his John, and I have my George." The comparison was utterly shocking. The King of England, the supreme governor of the Church of England, was publicly comparing his relationship with his male favorite to the relationship between Jesus and his most beloved disciple. This was not merely a defense of his political choices. It was a theological justification for his love. He was elevating his bond with Buckingham to a sacred, untouchable plane. This all-consuming relationship had immediate and profound political consequences. James, besotted and trusting, essentially abdicated the day-to-day running of his kingdom to his favorite. Buckingham, in turn, began to use his unparalleled power to enrich himself and his family. His mother, Mary Villiers, the woman who had engineered his rise from the beginning, became a powerful figure in her own right, a veritable political boss who controlled access to her son and sold her influence to the highest bidder. Buckingham's previously obscure brothers were made earls and viscounts. His cousins, nieces, and nephews were married into the greatest noble families in the land. This Villiers clan extended its tentacles into every corner of the government, creating a vast network of patronage and a machine for generating immense wealth. This blatant cronyism bred a deep and simmering resentment. The old established noble families, the Howards, the Herberts, the Cecils, were aghast. They saw their traditional rights and their access to the king usurped by this handsome upstart and his greedy relatives. They had helped create a new favorite to oust the old one, but they had inadvertently unleashed a force far more powerful and far more absolute than Robert Carr had ever been. They had intended for George Villiers to be their puppet. Instead, he had become their master, and his only strings were attached directly to the king's own heart. The Jacobean court, which had once been a complex balance of competing factions, was now a one-man show. And that man, young, handsome, and increasingly arrogant, stood at the right hand of a doting king, his power seemingly limitless. The golden age of Steenie and his dear dad had begun, but in their dazzling private world, they were deaf to the growing storm of envy, anger, and political opposition that was gathering just beyond the palace walls. Their great love story was planting the seeds of national division, and the harvest would be a bitter one. By the dawn of the 1620s, George Villiers, the first Duke of Buckingham, was not merely a favorite, he was a phenomenon. He had transcended the role of a mere courtier to become a parallel institution, a shadow government whose authority often eclipsed that of the king's own privy council. His power was absolute, his wealth was legendary, and his charm was, for a time, the glue that held the entire political structure together. The court was no longer the Jacobean court, it was the Buckingham court. His mother, the shrewd and grasping Mary Villiers, presided over a veritable marriage market, wedding her impoverished relatives into the greatest and wealthiest families in the land, a process one disgruntled observer called the Buckingham brood. The Duke himself, now a man in his late 20s, had evolved from a charming ingenue into a magnificent, if increasingly arrogant, prince of patronage. He was a dazzling patron of the arts, accumulating one of the finest art collections in Europe, with masterpieces by Rubens and Titian. He was a trendsetter in fashion, popularizing extravagant pearl-encrusted garments that cost more than a country gentleman's entire estate. He lived in York House, a palace on the Strand so opulent it rivaled the king's own residences. To his supporters, he was the vibrant, energetic center of a new, more glamorous political world. But to a growing number of Englishmen, looking on from outside the gilded circle of his favor, he was a canker on the Commonwealth, a beautiful parasite draining the lifeblood of the nation. The dazzling private world that James and his Steenie had built for themselves was founded on a bedrock of public resentment, and cracks were beginning to show. The first and most dangerous of these cracks appeared in Parliament. The English Parliament of the 17th century was a fractious and increasingly self-aware institution. It was not a permanent body like modern legislatures. The king called and dismissed it at his pleasure, usually for one reason only: he needed money. And James always needed money. He had inherited a significant debt from Queen Elizabeth and her long wars with Spain, and his own extravagant nature, his lavish hunts, his generous gifts to his favorites, the sheer cost of maintaining his royal court, had plunged the crown ever deeper into the red. Parliament, dominated by landowning gentry and Puritan lawyers, saw the king's financial desperation as their primary source of leverage. They would grant him taxes, but in return, they demanded a voice in the government of the realm. And their chief grievance, the symbol of everything they saw as rotten in the state of England, was the Duke of Buckingham. They saw his meteoric rise as a subversion of the natural order. They detested the system of monopolies he controlled. These were exclusive rights granted by the king to produce or sell certain goods, everything from glass and soap to the licensing of alehouses. Buckingham and his cronies controlled these monopolies, using them to inflate prices and line their own pockets at the public's expense. To the MPs, this was not just economic policy, it was corruption, pure and simple. A more profound source of anger was the sale of honors. To raise cash without going to Parliament, James and Buckingham had embarked on a wholesale devaluation of the English aristocracy. They created a new hereditary title, the baronetcy, which could be purchased for a little over £1,000. Soon, even older and more prestigious titles were on the market. Earldoms and viscountcies were sold to the highest bidder. This infuriated the ancient noble families, who saw their inherited status cheapened by a flood of new money. It also violated a deep-seated English belief in a divinely ordained social hierarchy. A man's place in the world was supposed to be determined by birth and land, not by the size of his purse. To them, Buckingham was not just enriching himself, he was poisoning the very wellspring of national honor. The leader of the parliamentary opposition was a formidable figure, Sir Edward Coke, a brilliant, cantankerous, and fiercely independent lawyer who was the living embodiment of the English common law. Coke believed that the law was above the king, a radical idea in an age of divine right monarchy. He and his allies in the House of Commons began to use their procedural powers to launch investigations into the monopolies and the corruption at court. They couldn't attack the king directly. That would be treason. So they attacked his favorite. In the Parliament of 1621, they successfully impeached one of Buckingham's key allies, the Lord Chancellor Sir Francis Bacon, for taking bribes. The message was unmistakable. They were aiming for Bacon, but they were thinking of Buckingham. James was forced to dissolve the Parliament in a rage to protect his beloved Steenie, but the battle lines had been drawn. The constitutional struggle between a king who believed his power came from God and a parliament that believed its power was rooted in law, and the consent of the people was now inextricably linked to the king's all-consuming love for one man. This domestic turmoil was playing out against a terrifying and chaotic international backdrop. In 1618, Europe had plunged into the sectarian bloodbath that would become known as the 30 Years' War. At its heart, it was a brutal conflict between Catholic and Protestant powers, and for King James, the war became deeply, tragically personal. In 1613, in what had been a major diplomatic triumph, he had married his beautiful and beloved daughter, Elizabeth, to a German prince, Frederick V, the Elector Palatine. In 1619, the rebellious Protestant nobles of Bohemia offered Frederick their throne, hoping to create a powerful Protestant bloc against the Catholic Holy Roman Emperor. Frederick, ambitious and egged on by his wife, accepted. Their reign in Prague lasted for a single winter. They were swiftly crushed by the forces of the Catholic League at the Battle of the White Mountain. Frederick and Elizabeth were forced to flee for their lives, their lands in the Palatinate were confiscated, and they became royal exiles, wandering the courts of Protestant Europe. To the people of England, this was an outrage. Elizabeth, now known as the Winter Queen, became a Protestant icon, a symbol of the international struggle against Catholic tyranny. There were impassioned calls for war, for a great Protestant crusade to restore the king's daughter and son-in-law to their rightful lands. But James resisted. War was messy, unpredictable, and ruinously expensive. It went against his most cherished self-image as Rex Pacificus, the peacemaker king. He believed he could solve the crisis not through war, but through diplomacy. He clung to a grand, ambitious, and deeply unpopular plan that he believed would be his diplomatic masterpiece, the Spanish Match. For years he had been negotiating a marriage treaty between his son and heir, Prince Charles, and the Spanish Infanta, Maria Anna, the sister of King Philip IV of Spain. To James's mind, the plan was ingenious. An alliance between Protestant England and Catholic Spain would create a powerful axis for peace in Europe. The Spanish, he reasoned, could be persuaded to use their influence to have Frederick's lands restored. Furthermore, the Infanta would come with a dowry of staggering proportions, rumored to be as much as £600,000, which would solve his financial woes at a single stroke and free him from his dependence on a hostile parliament. But to the vast majority of his subjects, the Spanish Match was a horrifying prospect. Spain was the national enemy, the bogeyman of the Protestant imagination. It was the nation of the Armada, the Inquisition, and the black legend of colonial cruelty. The idea of a Catholic queen who would inevitably demand toleration for English Catholics and might even raise the future King of England in her faith was anathema. For a time, Buckingham dutifully supported the king's policy. But the negotiations, conducted through a series of slow-moving ambassadors, dragged on for years. The Spanish masters of diplomatic delay made endless new demands. By 1623, a new and powerful player had grown impatient, the heir to the throne, Prince Charles. Charles was a very different man from his father. Where James was intellectual, garrulous, and informal, Charles was quiet, reserved, and intensely private. He had grown up in the shadow of his brilliant, athletic, and universally adored older brother, Prince Henry, who had died suddenly of typhoid in 1612. Charles, who had been a sickly child with a persistent stammer, was plagued by a deep-seated insecurity. He compensated for it with a rigid adherence to etiquette and a powerful belief in his own royal dignity. And like his father, he had fallen completely under the spell of the dazzling Duke of Buckingham. Buckingham was everything Charles was not: confident, charming, decisive, and effortlessly charismatic. The two young men became inseparable, forming a bond of intense friendship that gradually eclipsed the king's own relationship with his favorite. James was no longer just a husband to Steenie. He was now the dear dad to two sweet boys. It was into this potent psychological mix that Buckingham introduced a plan of such romantic folly, such breathtaking recklessness, that it could only have been conceived by a man who believed himself immune to all consequences. Frustrated by the endless diplomatic delays, he convinced Prince Charles that they should take matters into their own hands. They would bypass the ambassadors, travel to Madrid in disguise, and Charles would woo the Infanta in person, like a knight in a chivalric romance. It would be a grand, heroic gesture that would cut through the diplomatic red tape and seal the marriage in a single, brilliant stroke. Charles was enchanted by the idea. It was the adventure of a lifetime. The old King James, however, was horrified. He understood the immense risks. His son, the heir to the throne, traveling incognito through foreign, potentially hostile lands, the diplomatic fallout, if anything went wrong. It was a nightmare. He wept, he pleaded, he begged them not to go. He told them with grim foresight that it would ruin the very policy they were trying to advance. But he was old, tired, and sick with gout, and he was utterly incapable of denying his two beloved boys anything they truly wanted. In a scene of raw emotional agony, he finally gave his consent, watching his son and his favorite ride away on an adventure that threatened to destroy his life's work. And so in February 1623, the Prince of Wales and the Lord High Admiral of England, disguised with false beards and calling themselves Tom and John Smith, slipped out of London and began their secret journey to Spain. The trip itself was a boyish caper, filled with close calls and comical mishaps, but their arrival in Madrid sent shockwaves through the Spanish court. The Spanish were not charmed, they were appalled. Their court was the most rigid and formal in all of Europe, governed by an etiquette so strict it was almost a religion. The idea of the heir to a throne arriving unannounced, like a common traveler, was a scandalous breach of protocol. The cultural clash was immediate and profound. Charles and Buckingham, with their casual English manners, their boisterous laughter, and their habit of trying to get a private glimpse of the Infanta, who was kept in almost convent-like seclusion, were seen as boorish and disrespectful. Buckingham, in particular, with his flamboyant clothes and his arrogant, over-familiar demeanor, managed to offend nearly everyone he met. He treated the proud Spanish grandees with contempt and was seen as a corrupting, irreligious influence on the more pious Prince Charles. The negotiations, which they had hoped to conclude in weeks, became a masterclass in humiliation. The Spanish, realizing they held the ultimate bargaining chip, the person of the Prince of Wales, upped their demands. They insisted that the Infanta must remain in Spain for a full year after the wedding to ensure England complied with its promises. They demanded that any children be raised Catholic until the age of 12, and they demanded nothing less than the repeal of all anti-Catholic penal laws in England, something that was politically impossible for James to grant. Charles, desperate to win his bride, agreed to almost everything, signing away concessions that horrified his father back in London. But the more he conceded, the more the Spanish demanded. It slowly dawned on him that they had no intention of marrying the Infanta to a heretic prince. The entire negotiation was a sham, designed to keep England neutral in the 30 Years' War while they crushed the Protestant cause in Germany. After more than 8 months of frustration and mounting indignity, Charles and Buckingham finally admitted defeat. They left Madrid in a fury, empty-handed and feeling utterly betrayed. The Spanish match was dead. The journey home was a period of grim reflection. Their grand romantic adventure had been a diplomatic catastrophe and a personal humiliation. But Buckingham, the ultimate political survivor, saw an opportunity in the disaster. They would not return to England as failures. They would return as heroes. They would redirect their own personal anger and the nation's simmering anti-Spanish sentiment into a new, aggressive foreign policy. They would become the champions of the very thing the king had spent his reign avoiding: war. Their return to London in October 1623 was greeted with rapturous celebration. The English public, who had hated the Spanish match from the start, were overjoyed that it had failed. They lit bonfires in the streets and celebrated the prince's safe return from the clutches of the Catholic bogeyman. Buckingham and Charles masterfully rode this wave of popular euphoria. They went before Parliament and told a heavily biased version of their story, portraying the Spanish as treacherous and duplicitous, and themselves as staunch defenders of the Protestant faith. They demanded an immediate declaration of war against Spain. Parliament, which had for so long been Buckingham's greatest enemy, was now his greatest ally. They cheered his anti-Spanish speeches and for the first time seemed willing to grant the vast sums of money needed for a war. Buckingham had achieved the unthinkable. He had united the Prince of Wales and the Parliament against the king. For old King James, it was the ultimate heartbreak. He was now a lonely, isolated figure in his own court. His son and his favorite, the two people he loved most in the world, had publicly repudiated his life's great policy of peace. They had dismantled his grand diplomatic strategy and were now dragging him, against his better judgment, into a war he knew the country could not afford and was not prepared to fight. In his final months, he was a king in name only, a sad, sick old man forced to watch as Buckingham, now in an unholy alliance with his former enemies in Parliament, steered his kingdom towards a conflict he had spent a lifetime trying to prevent. The love he had poured into his beautiful Steenie had created a power so great that it had finally consumed his own. The final year of King James's life was a slow, agonizing twilight. The man who had prided himself on being Rex Pacificus, the great peacemaker of Europe, was now a virtual prisoner of a war policy he despised, a policy engineered by the two men he loved most on earth. His son Charles and his beloved Steenie now formed an unbreakable political dyad, attending council meetings together, planning strategy together, and presenting a united front that the old king was too sick and too heartbroken to resist. He was haunted by premonitions of disaster. "By God, Steenie," he lamented in one of their last arguments, "thou art a fool, and wilt shortly repent this folly, and will find that, in this fit of popularity, thou art making a rod with which thou wilt be scourged thyself." He saw the future with a terrifying clarity. He knew that Buckingham, whose genius lay in the seductive arts of the court, was no general. He knew the kingdom was financially unprepared for a major war, and he knew that the fickle affection of Parliament, which now cheered Buckingham as a Protestant hero, would turn to fury the moment the promised victories failed to materialize. But his warnings went unheeded. He had created a favorite so powerful, so intertwined with the heir to the throne, that his own royal authority had become a hollow echo. He was a king in name only, a sad spectator to the undoing of his own legacy. In March of 1625, James was struck by a violent ague, likely complicated by a stroke. As he lay dying at his favorite hunting lodge, Theobald's, it was Buckingham who remained his most constant companion. He nursed the old king, held his hand, and listened to his fevered ramblings. Even at the end, estranged by politics, but bound by 2 decades of shared intimacy, their affection remained. On March 27, 1625, King James I died at the age of 58. His last coherent words were for his family and for his sweet Steenie. He left his son Charles, a kingdom that was financially broken, politically polarized, and on the brink of a war it could not win, and he left him Buckingham. If Buckingham's enemies had harbored any hope that his influence would die with the old king, they were swiftly and brutally disabused of the notion. His power did not wane, it intensified. His relationship with the new king, Charles I, was just as profound as his bond with James, but it was different in nature. The overt, tactile passion was replaced by a cool, unshakable trust. Charles was not a man for public displays of affection. He was stiff, formal, and deeply conscious of his royal dignity, but he loved Buckingham with a fierce protective loyalty. Buckingham was his mentor, his confidant, and his only true friend. He saw Buckingham not as a subject, but as an extension of himself. In Charles's rigid black-and-white worldview, any criticism of the Duke was not a matter of political debate. It was an act of lèse-majesté, a direct and unforgivable attack upon the king himself. This fatal identification of the favorite with the monarch would set the new reign on a collision course with Parliament and the nation. The war with Spain, which Buckingham and Charles had so eagerly sought, began almost immediately. It was the Duke's first great test as a national leader, his chance to prove he was not just a pretty face, but a capable military commander. The result was a catastrophe of such epic proportions that it became a national scandal. In the autumn of 1625, Buckingham dispatched a massive naval expedition to attack the Spanish port of Cadiz. The plan was to seize the city and, more importantly, to intercept the Spanish treasure fleet returning laden with silver from the New World. The entire operation was a masterclass in incompetence. The ships were hastily refitted and barely seaworthy. The provisions were rotten. The beer so foul the men could not drink it. The soldiers were a rabble of untrained conscripts, many of whom had been forcibly pressed into service. The command structure was a chaotic mess of inexperienced officers. The fleet was battered by storms before it even reached the Spanish coast. When they finally landed near Cadiz, the starving, thirsty soldiers broke into a local wine cellar and got stupendously drunk. The assault descended into a chaotic, intoxicated farce. Fearing a Spanish counterattack on his incapacitated army, the commander had no choice but to re-embark his men and limp home in disgrace. They missed the treasure fleet completely. Of the more than 12,000 men who set out, thousands died, not from combat, but from disease and starvation. The Cadiz expedition was a national humiliation and a colossal waste of the money Parliament had reluctantly granted. The blame fell squarely and rightly on the Duke of Buckingham as Lord High Admiral. When Parliament was summoned in 1626, they were in a vengeful mood. They refused to grant any more funds until the man they held responsible for the disaster was brought to account. This was the moment the opposition, which had been building for years, finally coalesced. In the House of Commons, a group of powerful orators, led by the fiery Sir John Eliot, launched a direct assault on the Duke. Eliot, in a speech that would become legendary, did not mince his words. He compared Buckingham to Sejanus, the corrupt and power-mad favorite of the Roman Emperor Tiberius. He laid every ill the nation suffered at Buckingham's door, concluding with a thunderous denunciation. "I can hardly find a name to call him. He is the cause of all our evils." The Commons proceeded to draw up articles of impeachment against the Duke, charging him with a litany of crimes from corruption and incompetence to the illegal accumulation of offices. For King Charles, this was an intolerable affront. He saw the impeachment not as a legitimate political process, but as a personal attack on his friend and a direct challenge to his own royal prerogative to choose his own ministers. He went to Parliament in person and issued a stark warning. "Remember that parliaments are in my power for their calling, sitting, and dissolution. Therefore, as I find the fruits of them good or evil, they are to continue or not to be." When the Commons refused to back down, Charles carried out his threat. On June 15, 1626, to save his friend from trial and certain conviction, he dissolved Parliament. It was a fatal move. He had silenced his critics, but he had done so by shutting down the only institution that could legally grant him the money he so desperately needed. Undeterred by his lack of funds or his previous failures, Buckingham now embarked on an even more ambitious and reckless foreign policy. He had managed to entangle England not just in a war with Spain, but now in a new conflict with France. The pretext was to aid the Huguenots, the French Protestants, who were under siege by the forces of King Louis XIII and his chief minister, Cardinal Richelieu, in their coastal fortress of La Rochelle. In 1627, Buckingham decided to lead the relief expedition himself. This would be his moment of redemption, his chance to prove his military prowess and silence his critics forever. The Ile-de-Ré expedition was an even greater disaster than Cadiz. Buckingham showed personal bravery, leading from the front, but he was a catastrophic tactician. After landing on the island, he laid a long, ineffectual siege to the main fort. His supply lines were weak, his siege ladders were too short, and his army was gradually worn down by disease and French skirmishes. When a final desperate assault on the citadel failed, he was forced into a humiliating retreat. The French harried his army as they tried to re-embark, turning the withdrawal into a bloody rout. Of the approximately 7,000 men who had followed Buckingham to France, nearly 5,000 were killed or died of disease. Buckingham returned to England not as a conquering hero, but as a butcher and a fool, the man personally responsible for one of the worst military defeats in English history. He was now, without question, the most hated man in England. The public mood turned venomous. He was no longer just a political problem. He was a figure of folk demonology. Libels and satirical poems known as Buckingham's Epitaph were nailed to posts in London calling for his death. A popular rhyming curse declared, "Who rules the kingdom? The king. Who rules the king? The duke. Who rules the duke? The devil." He was blamed for everything. For military defeat, for high taxes, for the decline of trade, for the rise of religious dissent. To the common man, he was the source of all the nation's suffering. In the summer of 1628, defying all political logic and public opinion, the ever-loyal Charles and the unsinkable Buckingham began preparing yet another expedition to relieve La Rochelle. To fund it, Charles had been forced to recall Parliament and, after a bitter struggle, consent to the Petition of Right, a landmark document limiting the king's power. But even this concession did not satisfy them. The Commons drew up a new remonstrance, a formal statement of grievances, which explicitly named the Duke of Buckingham as the principal cause of the kingdom's miseries and demanded his removal from power. The document was printed and circulated throughout the country, giving royal sanction, in the public's mind, to the idea that the Duke was a national enemy. It was this document that found its way into the hands of a man named John Felton. Felton was a former army lieutenant, a man of melancholy and brooding disposition. He had served at both Cadiz and the Ile de Ré. He believed he had been repeatedly and unjustly passed over for promotion, and he blamed Buckingham personally. His personal grievances now merged with a sense of patriotic and religious duty. Reading the Parliament's remonstrance, he became convinced that Buckingham was not just his enemy, but God's enemy, the great evil plaguing the land. He saw himself as an instrument of divine and parliamentary justice. He bought a 10-penny dagger from a cutler's shop on Tower Hill and began to make his way to Portsmouth, where the Duke was overseeing the final preparations for his fleet. On the morning of August 23, 1628, Buckingham was in his lodgings in Portsmouth, a crowded and chaotic house filled with officers and petitioners. After a tense breakfast meeting, he rose to speak to one of his colonels. As he turned, John Felton stepped out of the throng, lunged forward, and plunged the dagger deep into the Duke's chest. Buckingham, a look of shocked surprise on his face, is said to have uttered a single cry, "Zounds, the villain hath slain me," before pulling the knife from his own chest, staggering a few steps, and collapsing dead in a pool of blood. He was 35 years old. The news of the assassination reached London later that day. The reaction was not one of horror or mourning, but of spontaneous, unbridled joy. People poured into the streets, lighting bonfires, drinking toasts, and celebrating as if a great victory had been won. John Felton, who was quickly apprehended, was not seen as a murderer, but as a national hero, a giant slayer, a David who had struck down Goliath. Poems were written in his honor, his portrait was sold on street corners, and people cheered his name. For King Charles, the news was an emotional cataclysm. He was in a nearby church at morning prayers when a courtier brought him the message. He showed no outward emotion, allowing the service to continue to its end. But then he retired to his private chambers and threw himself upon his bed, weeping with a grief so profound it would mark him for the rest of his life. He had lost his mentor, his brother, his only friend. But he had lost something more. He had lost his last human connection to the world of compromise and political negotiation. The public celebration of his friend's murder severed his final bond of trust with his own people. He blamed Parliament for inciting the hatred that had guided Felton's knife, and his heart hardened into an immovable core of autocratic resolve. The chasm between the king and his kingdom was now unbridgeable. This is the ultimate tragic legacy of the affair between King James and his George. The story does not end with Buckingham's death. His assassination was not the end of the crisis. It was the beginning of the final act. James's all-consuming need for a devoted partner led him to elevate one man above all laws, customs, and institutions. This act of private love had catastrophic public consequences. It corroded the finances of the crown, alienated the ancient aristocracy, and created a constitutional battle with Parliament that his successor inherited. Charles I inherited not just the kingdom, but the consequences of his father's passion. His rigid, unwavering defense of Buckingham and the deep personal trauma of his murder destroyed any hope of reconciliation. After 1628, Charles would attempt to rule without Parliament for 11 years, a period of personal rule that only deepened the grievances of the nation. When he was finally forced to recall Parliament in 1640, the unresolved conflicts of the past 3 decades exploded. The result was the English Civil War, a conflict that would tear the nation apart and end in 1649, with Charles himself being led to a scaffold to be tried and executed by his own subjects for treason. The seeds of that scaffold were sown 30 years earlier in the private chambers of a lonely, loving king and his beautiful favorite. So, how do we remember King James I? Was he the wisest fool, a brilliant scholar undone by his all-too-human heart? Was he the great unifier who inadvertently divided his own kingdom? The truth is, he was all of these things. He was a man of staggering contradictions, a king who believed his power came directly from God, but who gave his own power away for love. A peacemaker whose personal choices fueled the conflicts that led to a devastating war. A father to a nation who found his truest identity in the intimate role of a dear dad and husband to his beloved Steenie. For centuries, this part of his story was deliberately obscured. The raw, desperate passion of his letters was explained away as mere rhetoric, the intensity of their bond minimized to fit a more convenient, more sanitized version of history. But to ignore the love story of James and George Villiers is to fundamentally misunderstand the man, his reign, and the tragic course of the Stuart dynasty. It is a timeless story of public duty and private desire, a reminder that behind crowns and battles stand human hearts. King James I, for all his wisdom and all his majesty, was ruled by his heart, and in surrendering to that heart he set in motion the unraveling of a kingdom